there's something inside of us morally that makes us want to say it didn't dehumanize them. Look at how hard they fought in all of these, revolts and rebellions and everything like this. And it's been proven true in slavery's history that you can't take the humanity out of a human. And I don't think by recognizing dehumanization as a thing, I don't think that takes that away. I think it is important to recognize that people were regarded as property. I mean, it is a big deal. Um, to say that they're no more than, uh, to say that they were no more than a thing. I think people need to understand that that's the case. But it's definitely changed. I think it's definitely changed like how people approach the study of slavery in a lot of ways.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Javal Coleman. He is a doctoral student at the University of Texas in Austin. He does not have a religious or theological background for his academic career. He is a classicist, and this is one of my favorite kinds of people to talk to on here. Because I've said this before, I like to talk around the subjects of like the Bible and biblical text. So learning about the culture and the world and the history of the world that produced the Bible, that's always really exciting to me. So we'll get into what he wrote, what we're discussing in the interview. I will just say, if you're listening to this for free, please subscribe where you are, leave reviews where you are, leave a rating or whatever it is that they do wherever you're listening, whatever podcast platform that you're listening on. If you would like to go one step further, follow me on social media. There are plenty of options out there, whether it's Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Twitter, Threads, WordPress, Tumblr, YouTube. You can follow on any of those places, and I would love to hear your thoughts and get an idea of what you think. How well or how poorly the podcast, or how well or how poorly I'm doing in producing and hosting this podcast. You can also go an additional step further and become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeanspodcast for $5 a month. And that would be greatly appreciated as I slowly work toward my goal of this being the day job that I do. I'd also love to hear guest suggestions, episode feedback, just your thoughts on, maybe a direction I could pivot the podcast. Is there subject matter? Any subject matter. I want to hear any. I may not do it, but any subject matter. Let me know what you think. Yeah. So that said, here is my conversation with Javal Coleman. Javal Coleman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am a PhD student in classics at the University of Texas in Austin. I'm just now getting into the stage where I'm writing my dissertation, where I'm looking at the conflict between considering slaves as both people and property, and like how that is worked out in the legal literature. So yeah, and I'm married. I have almost married for 5 years now, actually, and we have a daughter who is about to be 4. So yeah, and I've been in Austin since 2020. I did my undergraduate at the University of North Texas over there in Denton, and I got a bachelor's in history with minors in Latin and a minor in classical studies. So that's me.
Well, congratulations. You're not in North Texas anymore. You get to be. I maybe I'm wrong, and most Texans probably wouldn't admit this out loud, but I think most of us are jealous of the Hill Country for just the weather and everything. I live in Houston. It's gross weather that may just get really harsh in the winter, and then North Texas is basically just southern Oklahoma, so it's just windy and annoying. So congratulations on being in the best part of Texas. Um, Wow. So I did not. Yeah, I guess I don't do a lot of biographical research because I don't want my thoughts to gear that way. So you're pretty early in your career, and did they seek you out for this contribution? Here,
Yeah.
hold on. Let me. Sorry, I didn't set this up. So we're going to be discussing your chapter in the book "Ancient Slavery and Its New Testament Contexts." Enslavement in the ancient Roman. Enslavement in the Roman world. So I'm Christy Cobb and Catherine Shaner reached out to you about that, or how did that work?
Yeah, yes, actually. I was they reached out to me, well now it was a couple years ago because these things take a long time to materialize. But I had written some blogs for the Society of Classical Studies like blog site, and I had written a few different things on ancient slavery, and they I don't like I don't know if I like describing it in this way, but they kind of blew up. And so I had several people reach out to me in response to me writing these blogs, and just with people just sharing their thoughts, and because I did a lot to uh, kind of relate what I was studying to my own kind of personal experience and upbringing, and so got a lot of people reaching out to me, and they actually reached out to me and were like, had liked the stuff that I had written, and was like, "You're clearly, have a deep understanding of this, and so can you write a chapter on this?" And it was one of my goals was like as I was getting my PhD was to publish, um, and so they were giving me that opportunity, and and I had already been familiar with both of their works. Um, and so yeah, it was I mean it was an honor. And I was glad that I got that opportunity for sure.
I mean, I don't know the full extent of it, but it's actually been kind of interesting. I've come across, I want to say two classicists I've interviewed for the podcast who aren't normally biblical studies people, and I think the other two they contributed articles to the Journal of Biblical Literature. It does. I don't know. Sorry, I told you I'm going to ramble to get thoughts out of my brain.
No, it's all good.
Um, it it almost seems like, I don't know, 200 years ago, it seems like a lot of classicists would have ended up doing a lot of biblical studies, particularly New Testament stuff. But I'm not sure if that world has become kind of insular as like its biblical studies world that maybe doesn't get a lot of influence from classics, because it seems like some of these guys are like, this is a methodology that it's existed in classic studies, or this is an understanding that's existed in classic studies that is new to New Testament studies. So, is that have you engaged much with Society of Biblical Literature or anything like that?
Yeah, I actually ended up those blog posts, a couple of them that I wrote, I actually ended up making connections with people in the religious studies circle. Um, so actually, I can't speak about uh, what, like where people in that circle of things think about like classics. But as someone in classics, I can say that as a discipline, we have tended to be more insular ourselves. Um, and so I think that there's a lot of there's much hard line of like, hey, no, if you're doing classics, you're doing classic stuff. That's biblical studies. That's a different discipline. I think that's changing in a lot of different ways. And so, for example, people such as like Candida Moss actually reached out to me over the blog, and her and I have got to know each other, and she's been a great mentor. And she's shared like work and asked, hey, what do you think about this from the perspective of someone who um, is not a biblical scholar? And I think that was one of the things that like that I think interested Christy and Catherine about me writing this chapter was that I'm someone that is not normally really thinking about um, the New Testament in an academic capacity. At least that's not my main thing. I'm definitely interested in the text for a lot of different reasons. But yeah, so I think more of us are trying to um, work together. But I would say, as in terms of an institutional level, there definitely seems to be like a hard separation of like, for me, like I go to the Society for Classical Studies meeting. I don't typically go to the SBL. But there'd be no reason why someone couldn't, from either discipline, go to either one and give a paper and, um, you know, work on research in those different areas.
I mean, even at AAR, SBL, walking around, I've only been to one. I went to the one in San Antonio in 2023, and walking around, it would be like, oh, middle aged to older, white balding man with a beard and a tweed jacket. That's SBL. And then like, oh, that lady kind of looks like Miss Frizzle. That must be AAR. Like, I could kind of tell the difference even there between the religious studies and the biblical studies people. But I, I think it's to the benefit of biblical studies that they hear um, again methodologies and approaches from classics because it seems to be helping. But yeah, I'll narrow things down to so your chapter, which when I came across the title of your chapter, it seems like a lot of the rest of them are kind of niche, and yours is just enslavement in the Roman world, and I'm like, all right, good luck, man. You got you got one chapter to cover all of this stuff, but um, you begin with the story of I believe it's Acti. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
What can you what? Why is Acti important?
So Acti, she's important because we don't have a lot of texts that tell us about um like real life experiences of enslaved people. So like most of what we have is literature where it is the perspective of like slave owners in different genres where they are doing fictional writing where they talk about enslaved people, and of course they're relating what they know about slaves' experience in their works. But that's different from this case where we actually have, and of course it's not from Acti's own perspective because it's a curse to her. Um, but what we have is we get a glimpse of an actual enslaved woman um, who had a very interesting story, which I could explain a bit.
Please do.
Yeah, so on the back. There's just this funeral inscription. And nothing too deep about that, except the mother of the child who it's dedicated to is erased. Her name's erased, and then on the back there is this curse addressed to this woman. Um, and it was the person who formerly owned her and ended up marrying her. And so what happened apparently, at least from um, this guy's perspective, is that he was nothing but good to this former slave of his. In fact, he manumitted her for free and took good care of her. But in reality, I mean, he didn't manumit her for free. He manumitted her on the condition that she marry him. So that's a price of a kind. So that's not really manumitting for free. But apparently, she wasn't satisfied with with the way things were, and she and some other people of the household absconded and apparently took some children. And we don't know if these children were just enslaved children that they just took with them, or if they were their kids. So there's much about it, her life and the situation that we don't know about. Um, but it's interesting that this situation where, um, it gives us evidence about a woman who was manumitted and clearly wasn't satisfied with how things were in her household, and so uh, ran away and took some property with her to presumably go and start her own life somewhere else. And the reason why this is interesting is a lot of the literature written by like aristocratic Romans would lead one to believe that slaves are like slaves and former slaves are satisfied with their relationships with their owners to the point where they don't mind sticking around. So, like, this is just a case where that stereotype isn't true. That in fact, this woman who was freed and had a life and a relationship with her former owner, she wasn't satisfied with that. And even if the particulars are biased because it's coming from his perspective, and there's probably a lot that he's assuming with this, and a lot that we're assuming with this. Um, it's still an interesting case because I think a lot of the aristocratic Romans who owned slaves themselves would like to think that once they freed their slaves, that their slaves would just be um, just be gracious and grateful, and essentially still do whatever they wanted for them. And in this case, you see that that's clearly not. And the reason why I actually picked this is because there are different. My idea for the chapter was to kind of pull at different threads um, that this text brings up, and kind of then draw out more. And so that's why I kind of centered the chapter around this text, because, like you said, doing just a chapter on slavery in the Roman world, there's so many different things you could talk about. I mean, there's so many different texts, so many different ideas, and so I think that I had also been reading this journal article by Catherine Kielmiller on like being manumitted for the sake of marriage and its practice in Roman law. And she used this text in that article, and I just was fascinated by it. And yeah, so that's kind of like where that all came from.
First, so this quote, and for listeners, you will have heard me use this phrase incorrectly in last week's episode, but John Adams said, "Power always thinks it has a great soul." I think I said, "Power always believes it has a beautiful soul," and that does seem like the point of view of these aristocratic enslavers. Is like, I'm a good guy, whether you are enslaving someone or manumitting them. Actually, you know what? This is just an aside. I reading your chapter, especially in the acting portion, I was just like, it's too late. It's too bad we're so late in Quentin Tarantino's career, because this could be like another Inglorious Bastards, Django type movie where you see something rad happening to people like enslavers. It's just, yeah, it's cartoonish violence can be applied against these people, and you feel no guilt seeing them pay for this particular crime. Uh, I think it's really easy for us to look back and say, like, yeah, that was bad. That was dehumanizing. And they really thought they were doing something good. And I think, and maybe I misread it, but we put a lot of emphasis on the dehumanizing part, which I think you accept and is true. But enslavement was, if my understanding of what you're saying is correct, predicated on the humanity of the enslaved. Do you have more to say on that? Or did I get something wrong?
No, no, no. I have so many thoughts about that. And this has been, I think, this has been something that's been percolating in my mind for many many years. Actually, ever since I was introduced to the concept of you know like I actually had a high school teacher talk about how slaves were dehumanized through their status and condition and treatment and everything like that. Well, something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I think that for me, now when I think of slavery being dehumanizing, to me, what I think of is in the literal sense that these people are treated and regarded as property in the law. And so they are made and, they are uh, analogized as like the same thing as like a chair or a four-footed animal, or a plot of land. There is laws in many different slaving systems that treat all of these as a form of property, and has specific laws regarding like how you can exercise ownership over these different kinds of property. So to me, where I think it's important to remember though is that in these slaving systems, slaves were also recognized as being people. And in fact, they profited off their humanity and their ability to experience suffering, and human suffering. Think about the classic example of, we have evidence from like the U.S. South, for example, where a slave owner wants to keep a slave in line, and so threatens to sell their family, split up their family. Like, they know that they can feel that, and that was a very real thing that they could profit off of. And so I think we should, like, where I think I'm trying to, where I push myself to think about this, and try to push others as well, is that we should keep in mind that even though these people regarded their slaves as property, and could treat them as they treated other forms of property, um, they still knew all too well that they were human. And in fact, this is like a central issue that you see in any kind of theorization of slaving, whether you look at Thomas Jefferson's personal notes or you look at the legal theorization of slavery in Roman law. Like, these are issues that come up, that there's this inherent tension in regarding this. And also at the same time, I think you have to take dehumanizing seriously, because if you look at the writings of someone like a Frederick Douglass, he saw the institution as dehumanizing, and he experienced it. And you can't just sweep that under the rug. Like, I think you have to like consider what that means and really wrestle with that. And so I think there's a lot of different tensions with this, and it's not all so cut and dry and straightforward as I think people would like it to be. And in fact, I can give a larger example of this tension that I find interesting, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So this isn't from the ancient world, but if we think about, for example, uh, the Three-Fifths Compromise, there's a scholar who wrote a very interesting article, kind of tracing, slaves, like the idea of slaves as both people and property in the law in the United States. And for the Southerners, they wanted it clear at law, in law courts, that their slaves were property, movable property, just like their animals and other things that they owned, and that they had property rights over them. But then in the Three-Fifths Compromise, well, they're like, well, they're actually also people. And so, you need to actually consider how many of them we have when you're counting our votes for certain things, right? And so that's how the Three-Fifth Compromise kind of came about, is that they wanted it both ways, but that's because also they recognized that it went both ways, right? That they were seeing these enslaved individuals as both people and property. Um, and yeah, and uh, it, it's also so complicated, because I think there is something about, for each of us, that there is a moral um, there's something inside of us morally that makes us want to say it didn't dehumanize them. Look at how hard they fought in all of these, revolts and rebellions and everything like this. Um, and it's been proven true in slavery's history that you can't take the humanity out of a human. And I don't think that that's I don't think by recognizing dehumanization as a thing, I don't think that that takes that away. I think it is important to recognize that people were regarded as property. I mean, this is a big deal. Um, to say that they're no more than, uh, to say that they were no more than a thing. And I think people need to understand that that's the case. But it's definitely changed. I think it's definitely changed like how people approach the study of slavery in a lot of ways. And if I'm, you let me know. Yeah, I know you said that it's our show, but if you,
I
yeah, you let me know.
Yep. No, you keep
Um,
going, man.
so it's changed the study of slavery in a lot of ways, and what I mean by this is now because it used to be the case that in slave studies, like, oh, the institution is so brutal, it's so horrible, it's dehumanizing, they were treated as property. It's all true, but um, I think there was a feeling of just kind of general hopelessness that you get from reading earlier scholarship, where it's like that's the whole slaving experience, is that they were property and it was dehumanizing and horrible. Those things are true, but we also know that uh, there's plenty of examples of slaves exercising an agency of some kind. Now, that has then led the pendulum to swing, I think, so hard in the other direction, where now it's like there have been plenty of studies, and this isn't a knock on them, but just I'm saying this as neutrally as possible. Like, there have been a lot of studies that now want to look at any example they can of resistance agency to show that no, see, like, these people who were regarded as property, they never stopped fighting to build a life for themselves and to make things happen for themselves or to build a family or and all of these things. And I think that there's a a balancing act that can be done where you don't forget the the property aspect of all of this, and you also don't forget that you know there were slave revolts and daily acts of resistance and all of these kinds of things. So yeah.
I I mean, American history is helpful. It is a helpful frame for this. So uh, I have a long commute. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I was listening to one where they were discussing kind of some of the legal battles that are happening now around the question of citizenship and the Dred Scott case, right? So 1857. So antebellum conditions. Roger Taney writes this decision that says enslaved, free, doesn't matter. Black people can never be citizens. And which just demonstrates at the core of this, it was always about power, right? Whether you are racializing it as American enslavement did come to do, or, and I mean, there are ethnic and racial components in antiquity as well, but it's a little bit more nebulous. I think we have a stark split in our brain, and we have this secure concept of, or rather, it's just an accepted, like an axiomatic understanding of citizenship now. And now we have people who are challenging it anew in a way that since the ancient world, it never really was challenged. And I worry that people are going to demur because there's a radical proposal being made. And like, I don't know, how do I know? I told you I could ramble too. How do I know what I always felt was, that we have not done a very good job of articulating this. And I promise I do have more questions about Actia and antiquity and things like that. But particularly as it applies to citizenship, what was the distinguishing characteristic or understanding of a citizen as opposed to an enslaved person or freed person, or how would you explain that?
Do you want to know specifically to the Roman world, to the Greek world? I could talk about either or both.
I want to hear whatever's in that noggin of yours.
Okay, so I think most of what I'm about to say applies really both to the Greek situation and the Roman situation. Um, so uh, one of the things about citizenship that is super important uh, is that it gives you, first of all, a legal recognition and protection of marriage and property rights and inheritance. Like you have to be a citizen to be able um, to be able to write a to be able to write a will that will be accepted. So, for example, one of the tensions actually where this comes up specifically with formerly enslaved people, and this is important, is that how you got manumitted mattered greatly. Because if you got manumitted in a way that wasn't recognized by the law, you would still be free, but you would not be a Roman citizen. And this is one of the things actually that's very unique to the Roman world is that slaves who were manumitted became Roman citizens. I mean, in most other places, this is not the case. Um, they would just be regarded as freed people and in their own kind of status category. So for example, in the Athenian world, if someone was manumitted, they did not become an Athenian citizen. Um, but in the Roman world, when you were freed by either in the presence of a magistrate, by will, um, um, yeah, by will and testament, you were recognized as a um, citizen. They also had this other form of manumission where you could be freed by writing, like getting your name written in the census. It was very weird, and that was a very quirky way because the census wasn't always taken, and that was very complicated. But um, if you were manumitted in front of a magistrate or by will, you would become a Roman citizen. And that means that when you died, you could actually leave something for your kids or, your family. But, and this is important, if you weren't, your property would refer back to, and this is specific to formerly enslaved people, not just like everyone. If you weren't manumitted by one of those legally recognized ways, when you died, if you had a family and all of that, your property would just revert back to the person who used to own you. And it was like as if you died as a slave. At least that's how the law explains it. So, um, but citizenship also meant a recourse to the courts, which is super important in a world where status was and social and legal status was um, seemed to be an arena, an arena of sorts. So, for example, there's actually a very interesting court case that we know of in Athens where this guy comes forward and one person says, okay, that person is um, actually my slave. Another person comes forward and says, no, actually, um, this guy is actually my slave. So two different people claiming him, and he's like, no, I'm actually free. Um, and one of the things that happens is the person that's arguing against this man and trying to prove that he is a slave is that, well, if you were free, how come when you were physically assaulted, you didn't go before the courts? Because this is a sign of a free person or a citizen, right? That you have legal redress to the courts. Um, and another important thing about citizenship in antiquity is the right to engage in politics, and that was a big thing. Being able to vote, being able to run for office, like you could only do those things if you were a Roman citizen or if you're an Athenian citizen, etc. So there are these different. Those are the main ones that I think of. So if you were a slave or former slave and you weren't a citizen, that's a lot of things that just there's a lot of things that you were disqualified from. Um, and so this also led to a lot of theorization of, well, if you used to be a slave, you're never really going to get away from that. There was this idea of this stain of slavery. Literally, they had it in the Latin, macula servitutis, a stain of slavery. That this concept that since you were like once you were enslaved, like you never really that stigma never really leaves your person. Um, and there are ways that this kind of shaped up in the law, and the fact that they were not able to participate in society as a full free person was able to. Um, so yeah,
So, okay, this was a question that was stewing in the back of my brain. We'll take Acti as an example. Acti presumably is a manumitted enslaved person who marries her former enslaver and then runs off with what he views as his property and is hanged, and he curses her. Um, so I'm guessing there was a difference between her manumission, or sorry, between her marriage to him and if he had just married someone who had been born free.
yeah,
How
yeah.
would you characterize that?
So, well, since she was, I mean, she uh, was owned by him, and so obviously he didn't have to provide like a dowry or anything like that. He just had to go before a magistrate. At least this is how we think the process worked. That he went before a magistrate and said, "Hey, I want to marry my slave," and get a certificate of some kind. Uh, and then the case is that anything that she had was really his still. And I mean, this was the case. Now, this is interesting because in the Roman household, the paterfamilias was the absolute head of the household. Everything in the house was his by right, by law. So, in a in some cases, it's not really uh, too different, except um, depending on how she was manumitted, which we don't know. So this is the thing: is that like we know that she was manumitted for marriage, but we don't know if this was like how exactly it was done, right? Because we don't have those details. Um, the status of their children would be a question mark. So whereas if he would have married a free person, those children are free. They're both free. Those children are free. They'll be born Roman citizens. In this case, um, I think that they would be. Uh, I think they would possibly still be considered um, Roman citizens, but it's murky. Um, so there are times like we have cases where people have there was this petition and response model in the empire where subjects could write to the emperor about any questions they had legally. Okay, we have like a handful of these that are about specifically like I think I'm free. What do you think, emperor? Um, and the emperor will write back the emperor's write back a variety of different responses. Sometimes it's the case that, well, um, since you were, even though you were born of a enslaved woman, since she was later free, you are free. Boom, there it is. Um, and they had this principle actually where they tended to lean towards freedom, interestingly enough, rather than saying like, no, actually that person should be regarded as a slave. But there's exceptions to that. Um, but yeah, so I don't think actually that there would be a ton that would be different legally. Um, I don't think that their marriage would be considered. Actually, no, no, no. I actually don't think that their marriage would be considered on the same legal status as, say, two free people's marriage. That'd be another thing. Um, but yeah.
So at its core, I don't know. I just keep running into all these things, arguments that ancient people will make. This has nothing to do with enslavement, but this idea that like, oh, the number four is significant in nature, like, and this is a person making a theological proposition. There's four gospels because there's like four parts of a walnut, and eh, like that kind of stuff seems like it's all over the place in the ancient world. Will they'll just be like, well, this is how we do things, so this must be how they are, and sitting here listening and thinking, like, trying to digest that, it seems like there's just a fundamental understanding, a difference in understanding of what humanity even is. Is that the case between what you and I as 21st century Americans? I don't know how far off we are in age. I'm 42. I imagine you're younger than that. Um, like for my whole life, I've had this idea because you talk about engagement in marriage, engagement in politics, just overall engagement as a citizen, and these are things that are taken for granted, at least in the United States. What am I missing that I just can't understand where they're coming from in this regard? It's
Mm.
probably a lot. You looked at me like I don't have time.
There's there's definitely a difference in how I guess we're regarding like how we regard what it means to be human and what it means to treat someone in a humane way. Um, so like for example, one of the developments that ends up happening is there actually ends up being more restrictions on like what um slave owners can do to their slaves in terms of, well, you can't just kill them just cause, and you can't just sell them to the like arena to be killed by gladiatorial animals or other gladiators just cause. Like you have to have reasons for doing these things. Um, and any kind of and then socially, right? So that's the legal aspect. Socially, then there's a lot of talk in philosophical writings and other texts about how one ought to conduct themselves, that extreme violence is actually a sign of a morally like flawed individual, and that it's actually a sign of someone who is given themselves over to luxuriousness. This is like something that the philosopher Seneca talks about a lot in his writings. But he's not the only one to think that there's something wrong with an extreme exercise of cruelty over even someone that is regarded again as property. So there,
like breaking dishes,
yeah,
doesn't it?
yeah. So there's a that's an interesting episode. So there is a this senator, uh, Vidius Pollio, who there's so many different authors in antiquity that talk about this guy for many different reasons. Um, but he apparently had these lampreys that he would feed his that he would like he would feed slaves to these lampreys whenever they would make a mistake or disobey him or whatever the case may be. One time he was having a dinner party and the Emperor Augustus is over, and a slave accidentally broke a jar or something like that, and he's gonna have him fed to the lampreys. And Augustus is like, "You're really gonna do this in front of me?" And then Augustus apparently ordered the slaves that were with him to break a bunch of glassware that this guy had. Um, and later on after he dies, he ends up dedicating his he ends up making this house to like a monument against luxuriousness. So a lot of writers write about this Vidius Polio guy, and it's like, well, his problem was that he was too excessive. He was too uh, he enjoyed too much in his I guess what I would consider he enjoyed too much in his exercise of ownership that he could just think that he could just kind of like throw these slaves away um, just because they made a mere mistake. But that episode is interesting also because this is the first time where this this is a time where the emperor is saying that even though you have certain rights, like rights of ownership and rights to your property, like I'm above that, and I'm telling you, you can't do this. But that's like a whole that is like a whole can of worms. But um, there's certainly something different. But at the same time, one of the things that's interesting, right, is that so there's some regard for there seems to be some regard for excessive violence towards enslaved individuals. Um, and one of the things that's interesting, though, is that I would actually argue that it's more so because it's a reflection of the person exercising the violence than a concern for the treatment of enslaved people. Because like every time that in most episodes where these kinds of things happen, they talk about the person who is doing the violence, not the person that the violence is done to. Um, and I think that's important. Um, so like that, there's something about it really says more about this person's character than it does that this poor uh, enslaved person is being brutally beaten. Um, so and also, uh, the you have the concept of just as we're talking about general um, humaneness. I mean, there was clearly a distinction in that they thought it was okay that if they looked at a baby and they saw that it had some kind of uh, disability or issues, or if it looked weird to them, they could just leave the baby, discard the baby, and just leave it, and someone would either pick it up or it would die. Um, so infant exposure was a thing, and they didn't really see a problem with that, as far as we can tell. Um, so yeah, and one of the things actually I think that's interesting about bringing in and thinking about things uh, with other like with like me as a classicist and thinking about things with people who are scholars of the New Testament, for example, is that there used to be this belief that like Christianity changed a lot of how people thought about things like slavery and thought about things like infant exposure. Doesn't really seem to be the case, though. I mean, if anything, I would argue that um, Christianity, for example, had more of a focus and pushing people to focus on the the soul rather than what's happening to themselves physically now. Um, So, I mean, there's obviously there's a lot of complications with that, but yeah. So I think there's but also the way that people thought about um, citizenship and what you ought to do, I think is also very different in antiquity. In that, like, if you are a full citizen, especially if you're a male, like you ought to serve your city in the form of politics. You ought to go and fight in the army. In fact, like most times you had to at least fight in the army, but you had to like you had to go and participate in the inner making of the state. and you were expected to, because this is just what you do as a citizen. So there is um, that aspect of it that I think is was certainly important to the ancients.
I think the thing that's particularly telling about you broke a dish or stoneware, glassware, whatever, and I'm gonna feed you. I'm gonna feed you to something here. But okay, assuming that that actually happened and he did it not just in front of others, but in front of someone who is, higher status than him. It's almost like an Uncle Tom's Cabin kind of thing to me, where it's a polemic against the very idea that, like, oh, but there are good masters, right? Because the book begins with a good master, and then that falls apart, and it's like, well, none of that really even matters. I would say your desire for people to show restraint toward these other humans they view as property, not yours, but one's desire for people to show restraint is irrelevant when, yeah, there's nothing to stop them from doing it unless a higher status person comes in. And on the point that you raise about, um, I'll limit it to the New Testament. The New Testament is not clear on like a rejection of enslavement, or it doesn't really give a full-throated appeal to a universal manumission. Early Christianity doesn't seem to do that. And I have more people to interview from this book who will do a better job of talking about that. But this was the way the world was, and I think we could give ourselves, for all the problems that still exist even in 21st century United States. I think we can give ourselves a pat on the back that we're doing a lot of work to restrain some urges in our human nature, or whatever it is, to be really cruel to one another, that in the ancient world just weren't there. And exposure of infants is one, enslavement of people is another. We have insulated ourselves from nature in more ways than just houses that aren't freezing or sweltering. So that, as insofar as my thoughts matter, that those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah,
No question, not a question there, but
yeah, no, and it's interesting because there aren't there's actually and I'll have to email you this, and maybe you can throw it in there as a suggestion. But there's actually an interesting book on attitudes towards like about slavery. It kind of traces like general attitudes, and has a lot of like discusses a lot of ancient authors and early Christian authors. And one of the things that is clear is that there were certainly people in antiquity who thought slavery was wrong, but that didn't um again, that didn't really materialize into anything. I mean, it's the same thing. Like one of the problems that I have had with um the kind of political talk about slavery is that when people think about the founding fathers, people will point to someone like a Thomas Jefferson and be like, well, like he said that slavery was wrong. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's all fine and good. He recognized that it was evil. I mean, he thought that God was going to, punish the country for the sins of slavery. He didn't do anything about it. He didn't, and even in a local sense, I mean, he didn't free any of his slaves upon his death or anything. So even if he recognized that there is something, um, there's something evil about the institution, uh, he still didn't. That's it. He wrestled with it in his head. That's like as far as I can give him credit for. And what I mean by that is that, like, I think one of the things that people like to do when thinking about slavery is, well, us moderns, we obviously recognize that slavery is this bad and um, evil thing, even though for the longest time that was just recognized as like this is just how it is. Um, but that's not actually not universally true. Um, and there was a recognition that there were problems with it. So I think that you know, uh, on the other hand, I think to pointing examples of people who had issues with it doesn't really, at least for me, it doesn't really do much for me. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in with the example of Thomas Jefferson, don't tell me your values, show me your budget. Like if you're like you're not just it's not even like he wasn't someone who didn't participate in it. He actively benefited from it. So your feelings are really hollow. Who cares if you think it's evil and bad? You're actively doing it, and so you know what you're doing is wrong. So you're certainly not an authority on this issue. Maybe on independence from a monarch, but I don't know how far your expertise goes on anything else. So because I don't want to eat up too much of your time, where would you send people? Or, sorry, actually, was there any part of the chapter that I didn't bring up that you were hoping that I would?
Um, hmm, trying to think. Uh, I don't think so. I think like we touched on different aspects uh that I either talk about in the chapter or that are raised in other um histories of slavery that I think are important. I guess uh I guess something I would like to say actually is one of the things that I talk about is you know, the experience of the enslaved, and that has probably been like the predominant focus on much studies on slavery, which I think is good. One of the things that I have thought about a lot though is like we really need to think about methodologically like how we approach doing these studies. Um, so for example, like one of the things that's been a big I guess hit in the study of slaveries is this using this concept of critical fabulation. Are you familiar with?
I am not.
So Saidiya Hartman, scholar of slavery in the Americas, has this idea. Is a great idea of kind of understanding enslavement through an exercise in um, what she calls critical fabulation, which is kind of like an imaginative uh, historiographical exercise where you might get information about someone like an actee and just to think through the possibilities of her life, you might reconstruct something of a fictive biography of her life through using like real details that we actually have to try and like get at that experience that is unspoken, that's kind of actually unattainable. But you do this in a way that you where you recognize and outline that this is fictive, that this is just a possibility of millions of possibilities. One of the things that this exercise has done actually is has shown the many different has just I think opened up even more so the idea and uh, of the slave experience being so multifaceted that it could be that a slave's life could have been lived in so many different ways. For me, that has been at least like the most important takeaway for me. The thing is that I think it's an approach that can also be uh, and I like the way that Hartman has applied this, but it's also an approach that could um, easily be misapplied, where someone is um, puppeteering for the dead, for the enslaved, where um, someone and in fact I have seen this be the case that someone has written something from the perspective of the enslaved in the sense that like using words like I and we and my. I think this is kind of dangerous because we don't want to ventriloquize those experiences. I think that takes us further away from the goal. Um, so I think that there's a lot of methodological issues that we all, I think, are need to wrestle with and need to um, push each other to think about and challenge each other on. I mean, I think that's super important. Is that we? It's important that we is just because the methodology gets uh very good and high traction. I think that doesn't mean that it's necessarily uh that it doesn't have issues. Like there's so many things for us to work out, and so many things in my own work that I would like to work out more. um so yeah, I just think that there's so much more to think with and to do, which is great. So
That, so that actually reminds me, I'd not heard that term, but there's a book, and I had the author on previously. The book's called Finding Phoebe. So Phoebe's just this person in Romans 16. It's the person that Paul is sending the letter to the Romans with, and he just mentions her. And so the author, Susan Hyland, she is working backward from just this mention and taking all of the details, the few details we do get, and inferring. So her life may have been like this. We know that women lived this way, and here's some of the facts around what it was like to be a woman. So here's someone who obviously has the means to travel. She's going from Cancri to Rome. Here's what that would have consisted of, and yeah, just property and virtue and the things that around a woman's life. And it sounds like that would be a really interesting book, something like that, to see for an historical figure like Acti, where there are not a lot of details, but to have a classicist, hint hint, to have a classicist maybe write a story that gives us exercises that, people like me, I'm not an expert, there are exercises where we can learn more about the ancient world and apply that to our understanding of this person. But on the topic of books and things like that, what would you recommend that listeners read, listen to, watch to learn more about? And it could be classics generally, or slavery in antiquity.
that is a huge question. So I'll try to be brief with that. Um,
Don't.
don't be brief. Okay, wow. Okay, well, on the note of Acti, actually, um, I actually have a chapter coming out with Danelle Padilla Peralta where we have half of the chapter is focused on um, Greek material, and the other half is focused on Roman material, and actually is specifically focused on Acti. And there's actually we do some of that thinking that I talked about before, some of that critical fabulation, and it sounds like this book that you mentioned, Finding Phoebe, that approach is the kind of thing that I think that's a very valuable approach. So I definitely I want to also be clear that I am not necessarily critiquing Hartman's. I'm not critiquing Hartman's method because I think it's a good one, but I think there has been some misunderstanding on how to apply it, and that is why I think there's some wrestling to be done. In terms of things that I recommend, there is this great book that compares Greek slavery amongst other Near Eastern societies in order to understand uh, the slaving system in that area as a whole. So it's a comparative work. It's very good. Um, and this is David Lewis's Greek slavery systems like in the Mediterranean. Yeah, it's on my bookshelf.
I'll
Um,
look it up. It's
yeah,
okay.
yeah. So by David Lewis, it's a very good study. He starts with like the Homeric uh, epics and Hesiod, and goes from that to ranging to talking about slavery in Athens to Israel to Carthage and Persia. So there's a lot of good stuff in that book. Um, One of my favorites for uh, thinking about the Roman world is by Kyle Harper, and it's just slavery in the late Roman world. Um, Rose McClain has a book called Freed Slaves and Imperial Culture, and that book is fantastic, where um, she actually looks at how freed slaves influence the culture of the Roman aristocracy in the imperial period, as in looking for and seeking honor, and how to go about that and how people wrote about that. So that's another really good one. I'm actually, funnily enough, I'm kind of old fashioned in the sense that I don't do a lot of watching and listening. I probably should, but I tend to just be a reader. But I'm trying to push myself to get more into um, podcasts. It's funny because there are times where I will listen to a podcast about something and then be like, I want to read about this, and then go look into it instead of just listening. Um, so yeah, those are some good ones. Trying to think. Mm, Slavery and Social Death by Orlando Patterson is like one of the most important books on slavery. Um, so that's another good one. There's a oh For people that want to like just get right into primary sources, there's actually a good uh, translation of a bunch of sources, literally called Greek and Roman Slaveries. And so if you just look that up, it's literally a collection of just different sources. So if people want to jump into that, um, yeah, those are my basic recommendations. Actually, no, I have one more. um, Walter Johnson has two books that I think that are both worth. One is called Soul by Soul, which is about um, slavery in the antebellum slave markets, and another is River of Dark Dreams, which is about slavery and the rise of capitalism in the U.S. South. Both I think, are essential reading if you study slavery. Um, so yeah,
Those are good. Yeah. I'm not cutting you off, am I?
no, no.
Okay. Those are good recommendations. What do you read for fun?
Oh, what do I read for fun? So this is a good question. I tend to have periods of time where I don't read much outside of work. And that is because there are times for my mind where it can be difficult to think, well, what do I want to do after I spent 50 hours reading this week? I want to read for fun. So there are times where I'm like, nah, that's not going to work for me. Um, but I like all kinds of stuff. Actually, I was recently rereading The Lord of the Rings because I got a newer edition of it. Um, so I love that. I love anything that has like a good mystery. Um, but not too nothing super cheesy. I'm not really like, I like mysteries that are like, I don't know, that aren't like haha see the twist kind of a thing. I like them to be a bit like deeper and tricky. That's like, I want it to really be like have me like puzzled. Um so uh I also read, and this is partly my wife got me into these. Um, I've also read the series that has Fourth Wing and Iron Flame and Onyx Storm now. So those are some very cool high fantasy novels that I actually liked a lot. Um, and then I also like to read. I also like to read poetry from other time periods. And sometimes this is poetry. Um, it's not for me. It's not work related, even though I guess someone could argue it is. I like reading like uh, classical uh, like adaptations from like different people of color, say like reading um, like a Sophocles in Spanish, but with a different with a different like but it's adapted, so it's not the actual exact story of like say Antigone, but it's based on that. Um, so yeah, uh, but again, like there are periods of time where I have to spend most of my time reading, and then I don't want to read outside of that. Uh, but then
So what do you do to decompress in those times?
a combination of just hanging with my family and watching movies. I'm a big movie guy. I love going to the movies. So I have like the theater here. I have like a movie pass, so I pay about $15 a month, and I can go see whatever movie I want, however many times a month. So usually, like, if everybody's kind of like got their own thing, there'll be a time where, um, like, I'll just go to the movies myself and watch a movie. I went and saw Sinners. That movie was amazing. Um, highly recommend it. It was really really good. Like for me, it was almost as good as Get Out, which is hard to top. So really big into movies, and then at night, I don't usually sleep early, but my kid does, and my wife does as well. So I play video games. So that's another thing.
What do you play?
I would describe myself as a variety kind of guy. So like I have stuff that I probably my favorite thing to play is like uh single player games that are story driven. Um, Probably my favorite game ever is Red Dead Redemption 2 because the story is just so good and the protagonist is so compelling. So even though this is not academic, if you like video games, play Red Dead 2 because that game is amazing. Um, but and I also play different like multiplayer games as well. So
Somebody a few months back, I was working nights, and I knew I would need something to like help me stay awake all night to get on that schedule. And somebody recommended the Hogwarts Legacy game, and I'll be honest, it sucked me in. I'm a sucker for an open world game where I could just explore a map, and because from like I think for like 9 years before that, I had just been playing the Division, and I'll just keep replaying the same game. I like games I can be bad at, and I could just play on my own, and I figure them out. I just do a bad job till I figure them out. Um, I You know what? I love going to see movies. I'll say this, listeners. By the time this comes out, go stream Sinners. I haven't seen it yet because it takes me a few months to get things out, but I think my favorite thing is going to a movie theater on a weekday or like first showing on a Sunday when nobody's there and just being alone in a dark theater. I love it, but I don't get to do it enough. So you're reminding me I need to get out there and do that more.
definitely, there's so many good movies that are out and that are going to be coming out. So, um, uh, yeah, so it'll be cool.
All right. Well, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Yeah, just wanted to say thanks so much for having me. Um, and yeah, it was great.
Well, Javal Coleman, thanks for being here, man. Take care.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, like I said, I really like talking around these subjects. And when I come across a classicist, which I did not think my first classicist would have happened where they happened, but it was Anthony Ellis, and we were talking about Hebrew Bible. So that one did surprise me. But this makes absolute sense to be talking about, uh, slavery in ancient Rome. Um, so yeah. Everything I said at the top of the episode about social media, following where you're listening, or becoming a Patreon supporter, if you are so inclined, I'll appreciate any of those things. Any feedback you have for me, send it to it. It means what it means at gmail.com. All one word, it means what it means at gmail.com. I'll do my best to make sure if it ends up in the spam folder, I catch it and take it into consideration. Next week, David DeYoung, and we will be discussing the anti-eschatological Elijah. I can't really go too much into that now because, well, you'll have to wait a week unless you want to hear it now or watch it now on Patreon. As of this episode being out, next week's episode is available on Patreon for $5 a month. So hit us up over there, become a supporter, and help me move toward my goal of doing this podcast as my day job. Okay, that's it from me. Here's a preview of my conversation with David DeYoung. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Take care.
Well, I mean, Handy Nyman's work is very interesting in terms of that assumption, right? Because this whole development of pseudepigraphal works and what are some of the worldviews behind associating works with Enoch and with Moses and with, one thing to sort of keep in mind is that, Judaism at the time of Jesus or before the time of Jesus, a lot of people are not assuming, if you say Moses wrote 5 books, a lot of people are assuming Moses wrote a lot more than 5 books. What are you talking about, right? Like even the Pentateuch is a contested idea. And what's in the air there is the prestige of antiquity. And we have the Assumption of Moses and the Testament of Moses and the Book of Jubilees and all these other Mosaic traditions that were influential. And then we got this Enoch guy who wrote a whole bunch of stuff. One thing that we have is we do have a sense of sort of the publicly received scriptures, which there's no canon yet. They're not defined. It's not strictly demarcated, but certainly Torah and prophets are important to that. And then we have a sense of a broad literature that different groups are drawing on different traditions, some more than others, and that a lot of these texts are essentially interpretive. They're appealing to antiquity. They're definitely appealing to the authority of great figures from antiquity, but they're also attempting to inhabit that tradition today. And maybe these appeals to Moses and Elijah at the end of Malachi are just a part of that broader sense of an appeal to antiquity that has to sort of be relevant today in our moment, in our time. There's something very kind of attractive about that idea of situating even these sort of texts in light with these broader developments. Why did pseudepigrapha emerge? Why do we get this kind of flourishing literature that's very interpretive and very focused on what does it mean to inhabit these traditions and keep them alive?